What if someone you trust has already decided to leave and you have no idea? Not because they're hiding it, not because they're playing games, but because the decision formed so deep inside their psychology that by the time you notice anything, it's already done. And here's the part that should stop you cold. There were signs, there were always signs. You just didn't know what you were actually looking at. Most people watch for the obvious, the argument, the cold shoulder, the dramatic pullback. We've been wired to expect conflict as the warning signal, so when there's no conflict, when everything feels calm, when the person is still present, still responding, still showing up, we assume safety. We assume the connection is intact. That assumption is exactly where it all falls apart, because this type of person doesn't warn through conflict, they warn through observation, silently, precisely, invisibly. While you're reacting to what just happened, they are tracking what keeps happening. While you're processing a single moment, they are cross-referencing it against every repeated behavior, every broken pattern, every gap between what you said and what you actually did. They are not reacting, they are recording. And when enough data is recorded, the brain doesn't stay in analysis forever. It reaches a conclusion. No announcement, no warning, no visible shift, just a quiet internal lock. And once that lock clicks into place, what was once openness becomes permanent closure, not through anger, not through resentment, through clarity. And clarity is far more final than anger will ever be. What if someone you trust has already decided to leave and you have absolutely no idea? Not because they're hiding it, not because they're being dishonest or playing some kind of calculated game, but because the decision formed so deep inside their psychology, so quietly and so precisely, that by the time anything becomes visible on the surface, it's already been done. The exit was already completed. The conclusion was already reached, and you were still standing there assuming everything was fine. That is the reality most people never see coming, and that's exactly what makes it so difficult to process afterward. Because when it finally becomes obvious, when the distance becomes undeniable and the silence becomes permanent, the first question most people ask is, where did this come from? They replay conversations. They search for the moment things changed. They look for the argument that started it, the event that triggered it, the specific thing that went wrong, and they come up empty, because from the outside, nothing looked broken. From the outside, everything seemed normal. The person was still there, still responding, still present in all the ways that made you believe the connection was stable. But here's what was actually happening beneath all of that. There is a system behind this behavior, a real measurable psychological sequence that runs silently underneath every conversation, every interaction, every moment of connection between two people. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send signals most people know how to read. It simply runs, collecting, processing, evaluating, completely beneath the surface of what looks like normal, everyday interaction. Most people are wired to watch for the obvious warning signs, the raised voice, the cold shoulder, the visible withdrawal, the dramatic moment where someone finally says enough and makes the tension impossible to ignore. We've been conditioned our entire lives to treat conflict as the signal, the indicator that something is wrong and needs attention. So when there is no conflict, when the tone stays even and the person stays present and nothing feels visibly broken, we settle into comfort. We decide things are okay. We stop paying attention to the subtler signals because the obvious ones never showed up. And that is precisely where the misreading happens. Because this type of person doesn't communicate damage through conflict. They process it through observation, quietly, internally, with a level of patience that most people mistake for acceptance. While you are focused on what just happened between the two of you, they are focused on what keeps happening. While you are reacting to a single moment, they are placing that moment alongside every previous interaction, every repeated behavior, every instance where what was said didn't quite match what was done. They aren't responding emotionally. They are building a picture, carefully, consistently, without ever letting you know that the process is even happening. And the human brain, when it builds enough of that picture, doesn't stay in observation mode forever. At some point, the data stops being collected and starts being understood. The pattern stops looking like a series of isolated moments and starts revealing itself as something fixed, something structural, something that isn't going to change. And when that recognition lands, when the brain finally crosses from interpreting to knowing, Something shifts internally that no amount of external behavior can reverse. Before that shift, there is still openness. There is still the possibility that things could move in a different direction, that the inconsistency was temporary, that the pattern might break. But after that shift, that openness is gone. Not violently, not dramatically, just completely, because clarity doesn't leave room for maybe. And once it arrives, it doesn't ask permission to stay. Most people expect a breakdown. They expect tears or anger or some kind of visible collapse that signals the moment everything fell apart. They wait for the dramatic scene, the confrontation, the ultimatum, the door that slams loud enough to make the ending feel real. And when none of that happens, when everything stays quiet and composed and almost unnervingly calm, they convince themselves that nothing is actually wrong. That is one of the most costly misreads a person can make. Because what looks like composure from the outside is something else entirely on the inside. It isn't peace, it isn't indifference, it isn't someone who doesn't care deeply about what's happening between the two of you. It is precision. It is a mind that has moved past the emotional noise and arrived at something far more structured. A clear clinical understanding of exactly what is happening, exactly what it means, and exactly what needs to happen next. And precision, unlike emotion, doesn't waver. This is the part that most people fundamentally misunderstand about this type of person. They assume that calm means comfortable. They assume that the absence of visible distress means the connection is still stable, still intact, still something that can be worked with. But behavioral science tells a completely different story. The calm isn't a sign that nothing is wrong. The calm is a sign that the conclusion has already been reached. And conclusions don't need drama to be real. Think about what emotion actually does to a decision. Emotion keeps things open. When someone is angry, they still want something from you, a response, an acknowledgement, a change. When someone is hurt, they're still emotionally invested enough to feel the pain. Emotion, as uncomfortable as it is actually a signal of continued attachment. It means the connection still has enough weight to produce a reaction. It means there is still something there worth feeling strongly about. But when the emotion clears and what replaces it is not relief but quiet understanding, that is an entirely different state. That is a person who has moved through the feeling and arrived somewhere beyond it. Somewhere that doesn't require your input to feel stable. Somewhere that isn't waiting for you to respond differently, explain yourself more clearly, or show up in a way that changes the conclusion already sitting in their mind. This is what behavioral science identifies as regulated detachment, not emotional shutdown, not coldness, not a wall built out of self-protection, but a calm that comes from internal resolution. The kind of calm that doesn't need the situation to change because internally the person has already adjusted to a reality where the connection no longer holds the same weight it once did. And what makes this so difficult to recognize in real time is that it doesn't look like what we expect distance to look like. They're not short with you. They're not visibly pulling away. They're not giving you the signals that movies and television have trained you to associate with someone checking out of a relationship. They respond, they engage, they maintain the surface level of the connection with a consistency that makes everything feel normal. But underneath that surface, something fundamental has already shifted. The emotional architecture of the connection has been quietly restructured. What was once built on openness and vulnerability and real internal access has been replaced with something more managed, more measured, more deliberately controlled, not out of manipulation, not out of cruelty, but out of an internal need for stability that has already decided where the boundary now lives. You didn't see it coming, and that's not a flaw in your awareness. That's exactly how this process is designed to work, because this wasn't something that happened to you suddenly. It wasn't a decision made in a single moment of frustration or a reaction born from one difficult conversation. This was something that built slowly, quietly, and completely beneath the surface of everything that looked normal between the two of you. And while it was building, you were living inside what felt like a stable connection, responding to what was visible, trusting what was present, believing that the absence of obvious conflict meant the foundation was still solid. But here is what was actually happening on the other side of that connection. Every interaction you had was being processed at a level most people never operate at. not consciously monitored in a way that felt calculated or cold, but naturally, almost automatically, the way a highly sensitive internal system processes everything it comes into contact with. Every conversation carried weight beyond the words. Every moment of inconsistency was registered, not filed away with resentment, but noted with a quiet precision that never needed to announce itself. Every time what you said didn't quite align with what you did, that gap was measured, not judged immediately, just recorded. And you had no idea any of this was happening, because nothing on the surface gave it away. That's the part that makes this so personally disorienting when it finally becomes clear, because you weren't being deceived, you weren't being set up for a fall. The person in front of you was genuinely present, genuinely engaged, genuinely trying to make sense of the dynamic between you. But the internal system running beneath that presence was doing something you couldn't see, building a picture layer by layer, interaction by interaction, until the picture became clear enough to act on. And here is where it gets personal, because this wasn't just about what you did or didn't do, it was about what kept happening. The pattern, the repetition, the moments that felt isolated to you but connected to them in ways that gradually shifted how they experienced the entire relationship. You may have thought a particular moment passed without consequence. You may have assumed that because nothing was said, nothing was registered. But the internal record kept moving forward regardless of whether the external conversation ever caught up to it. This is the part most people only understand in hindsight. You replay the timeline, and suddenly the small things stop looking small. The moment they went a little quieter than usual, the conversation where the warmth was still there, but something underneath it felt slightly different. The time they responded, but the response felt more managed than open, more measured than free. You noticed something in those moments, maybe not consciously, maybe just as a vague feeling you couldn't quite name, but you didn't know what you were actually seeing. You were seeing the process in motion, and the difficult truth is that by the time those signals were visible enough to register, the internal shift had already been happening for longer than either of you may have realized, because this isn't a process that starts with the moment you finally notice something is off. It starts much earlier, in the quiet accumulation of data that never made enough noise to demand your attention, but never stopped adding to the picture being built on the other side. You were present for all of it. You just didn't know what language it was being written in. And by the time the translation became clear, the page had already been turned. There is a warning that was issued. You just never heard it, not because it wasn't there, not because it was hidden deliberately or withheld out of cruelty, but because it was never delivered in a language most people know how to receive. There was no conversation that started with, "I need you to know something is changing." There was no moment where the shift was named out loud, placed on the table between the two of you, given the kind of direct acknowledgement that would have made it possible to respond to in time. The warning existed. It was real, it was consistent, and it was communicated, just not through words. And that is exactly why most people miss it completely. We are trained from early in life to wait for the explicit signal, the direct statement, the moment someone uses their words to tell us that something is wrong, something has changed, something needs to be addressed before it becomes irreversible. We trust verbal communication as the primary channel for important information, and because of that, we tend to discount or overlook everything else. The shift in tone that isn't quite explainable, the response that arrives a little slower than it used to, the conversation that covers the same surface but somehow feels like it's coming from a slightly greater distance. We notice these things somewhere beneath conscious awareness, and then we talk ourselves out of them because nothing was actually said, but something was being said. Constantly. Through every one of those signals. The invisible warning doesn't arrive as a statement. It arrives as a pattern of behavioral shifts so gradual and so subtle that by the time they accumulate into something undeniable, the internal process they were signaling is already in its final stages. This is what makes it so disorienting in retrospect, because when you look back, the signals were never truly absent. They were present across the entire timeline, moving in a consistent direction, telling a coherent story that only becomes readable once you know what language it was written in. Think about the last time something felt slightly off, but you couldn't point to a specific reason. The interaction was normal enough, the words were fine, the person was there. but something in the quality of their presence had shifted in a way that registered somewhere in you without ever fully surfacing into conscious thought. That feeling wasn't imagination. That feeling was your own perception picking up on data your conscious mind hadn't yet processed into meaning. The invisible warning was landing. You just didn't have the framework to interpret what it was telling you. Because here is what behavioral science shows us about how this type of person communicates a deteriorating connection. They don't escalate, they de escalate. While most people become louder, more reactive, more emotionally visible as a connection starts to strain, this type of person moves in the opposite direction. They become quieter, more composed, more internally self contained. The emotional temperature of their engagement drops, not dramatically, not in a way that demands immediate attention, but measurably, consistently, in a direction that only becomes obvious when you compare who they were 6 months ago to who they are right now in the dynamic. And that comparison is something most people never think to make until it's too late, because we evaluate connections in the present tense. We assess how things feel right now, in this conversation, in this moment, against what we remember feeling before. But memory is imprecise, and the shifts were gradual enough that the distance between then and now never felt like a single dramatic leap. It felt like nothing. It felt like normal. It felt like everything was still essentially the same, but everything had already been quietly, invisibly, and permanently changing all along. This is not about feelings. This is about a system. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because the moment you start trying to understand this through the lens of emotion alone, you lose the ability to see what is actually happening. You start asking the wrong questions. You start looking for the wrong signals. You start measuring the wrong things. And while you're doing all of that, the actual process continues moving forward with complete indifference to whether or not you've understood it yet. So let's talk about what this actually is at a structural level. The human brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine, not metaphorically, literally. The primary function of the brain beneath all of its complexity is to take incoming data, compare it against existing data, identify what repeats, and use that repetition to build predictive models about what comes next. This is not a conscious process. It doesn't require deliberate attention or intentional analysis. It runs automatically, continuously beneath the surface of everything else the mind is doing, and it never stops collecting information just because the conscious mind has decided everything is fine. Now take that biological reality and apply it to a person whose perceptual sensitivity is operating at a significantly higher level than average. A person whose internal system is not just passively receiving data, but actively cross-referencing it across time, across context, across the full history of every interaction they've had with you. Every moment of inconsistency gets measured against previous moments of inconsistency. Every behavioral pattern gets mapped against the stated intentions that were supposed to produce different behavior. Every gap between what is said and what is done gets logged, not out of suspicion, not out of distrust, but because the system is simply built to notice these things. It cannot do otherwise. And here is where the specificity becomes critical, because this process doesn't operate on generalities. It doesn't respond to the overall feeling of a relationship or the broad emotional impression of a connection. It responds to specific data points, specific repeated behaviors, specific measurable gaps between words and actions that accumulate over specific periods of time until the weight of the accumulated data crosses a specific internal threshold. That threshold is not arbitrary. It is not emotional. It is not based on how much the person cares about you or how deeply the connection was built. It is based purely on the ratio of consistent data to inconsistent data. And when that ratio tips past a certain point, the internal system doesn't wait for permission to respond. It simply responds, the way a compass responds to magnetic north. Not because it decided to, because the underlying mechanics left it no other option. This is why understanding the behavioral sequence matters more than understanding the emotional experience of it. The emotional experience is real, deeply real for everyone involved, but emotion doesn't explain the mechanics. And without understanding the mechanics, You are left reacting to outcomes you could never predict because you were never tracking the inputs that produced them. The sequence is specific, the triggers are identifiable. The threshold is measurable in behavioral terms even when it's invisible to the naked eye. The detachment follows a documented progression with distinct stages that move in a consistent direction regardless of the external circumstances surrounding them. And the final state, the complete internal exit that precedes any visible external change, is the inevitable result of a process that was always moving toward resolution from the moment the first consistent pattern was confirmed. This is a system, it has structure, it has sequence. It has a beginning, a progression, and a point of no return, and every single stage of it was already written into the mechanics of how this type of mind actually works.